Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
It was the first time in 35 years that I didn't even bother to blow out a candle. And not because I forgot or ran out of matches, but because I deliberately left the cake untouched and cold, like the dining room I chose not to sit in. As if the silence could somehow speak louder than the years of unspoken disappointment. That day, my birthday, came and went with nothing but a nod to the mailbox, where I had dropped a letter I knew would change everything. A letter that didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't explain, and certainly didn't offer an apology. And I knew, deep down, that if my father ever opened it, the words he read wouldn't just challenge the way he saw me, but shatter it. He used to say things like that often. You're too ordinary to celebrate. Like it was a joke, a punchline to my existence that somehow never got old for him. He said it when I was 7 and got my first A on a math test, handing it to him like it was a lottery ticket. His only response being a shrug and a half smile before adding that ordinary kids do well in school sometimes. He said it again when I turned 12 and baked my own birthday cake because Mom had to work the night shift and Jake was at football camp, and I just wanted someone to notice. The candle wax dripped onto the counter that night while I waited for him to come home from his favorite bar, and when he finally did, he told me the cake looked store-bought, like I didn't even try by the time I was in my 20s. He didn't have to say anything anymore. The silence had settled in like dust in a forgotten room, and I had learned to stop asking for anything that felt remotely like affection. This year, I didn't tell anyone what I had planned. Lisa, my best friend since college, knew something was up because I canceled our annual birthday hangover brunch without giving a reason. I just said I needed a day to myself. She texted twice, called once, but I ignored it. Not out of rudeness, but because even she couldn't understand what it meant to walk into another year of life carrying the same weight you were born with. The sense that no matter how far you run, you never really get out from under it. I sat at my kitchen table that morning with the sun pouring in through the blinds, holding a coffee mug that read, "Keep it together," a gag gift from Jake last Christmas, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt like I was finally unraveling in a way that made sense. The paperwork had been finalized 3 days earlier, the money transferred. My lawyer, Ruth, a stern woman with the patience of a saint, called to confirm the mortgage on my parents' house was now listed as paid in full. I asked her to mail the confirmation letter directly to their address. No return envelope, no business card, just a single note handwritten on the bottom. Happy nothing special day. That was all. And as I sat there sipping my lukewarm coffee, I waited for something inside me to click. Relief maybe, or closure, but nothing came. Just a stillness I hadn't felt in years. Like a noise finally stopped humming in the background of my life. I didn't feel vindicated or smug or even proud. I felt tired. But the kind of tired you get after a long uphill climb when you finally see the peak. And even though you know there's a long walk back down, at least now you know you're not standing at the bottom anymore. They say birthdays are supposed to be a celebration of your life. That's the funny thing, isn't it? I don't remember ever feeling like my life was something worth celebrating, at least not to them. Jake always got the big parties, the backyard barbecues, the helium balloons with the big gold letters. My birthdays were usually an afterthought. One year, they actually forgot. Just plain forgot. I was 21, home from college, and not a single soul said anything until Mom realized the date 2 days later and asked if I wanted to go out for lunch. I said no. What was the point? So this year, when I chose to do nothing, to say nothing, I wasn't trying to be dramatic or cruel. I was simply done asking for the bare minimum. I didn't want candles or cards or a dinner where everyone pretended they hadn't spent the rest of the year ignoring me. I wanted the silence. I needed it. Because in that silence, I finally had the space to do something none of them ever did. I honored my own survival. The letter was delivered the next day. I imagined Mom would open it first because she always got to the mail before Dad. She'd see the official seal from the bank, maybe think it was junk or some refinancing scam until she read the attached note. I pictured her face as she read it, the slow dawning horror that it wasn't a joke, that their daughter, so ordinary she never deserved a party, had just erased one of their biggest burdens without asking for a thank you. And that was the point. No more explaining, no more performances, just facts. Cold, hard proof that I had survived them. And that, in itself, was worth celebrating. The silence lasted all day. I didn't hear from anyone, no calls, no texts, nothing. And then, just after midnight, I sent them one text. Check your mailbox tomorrow. I knew that once they read what I'd done, there'd be no going back. The morning light filtered softly through the thin curtains of my parents' kitchen when my mother opened the mailbox and pulled out the envelope I had left there just hours before. A simple manila folder that seemed so innocuous that it almost felt like a cruel joke. But as she unfolded the contents and her eyes scanned the words and the official document beneath them, the silence that followed spoke volumes louder than any scream I could have unleashed. It was in that quiet, tense moment that I realized how little my parents truly expected from me, how the years of being dismissed had left them utterly unprepared to handle a gesture that didn't come with strings attached, or the usual demands for gratitude and ceremony. Inside that folder was the certified check that paid off the remainder of their mortgage, the house they'd lived in for nearly 25 years now, a house I had been told countless times growing up wasn't mine to worry about, that it was their burden, their responsibility, their pride. But I decided that on this birthday, the day I was supposedly too ordinary to even have a celebration, I would flip the script in a way they could neither ignore nor diminish. I imagined the weight of those papers in my mother's hands, the sharp ink of the bank seal, the way the number written on the check made it impossible to deny the scale of what had just happened. A quiet, unannounced severing of a debt that had tied them to a life of financial stress and stubborn pride. And as the morning wore on, I pictured the mixture of emotions that must have flooded through them. My father, who was used to being the one in control, the provider, the man who made the decisions and basked in the grudging respect that came with that role, now faced with the fact that I had stepped into his territory without permission or fanfare, while my mother, who always wanted peace, yet was caught in the middle of the silent storm, probably struggled with the urge to call me and demand explanations, or worse, try to soothe the wounded pride that had long defined her marriage. The truth was, I had spent years wrestling with whether to do this at all, knowing full well that it would complicate the already fragile dynamic between us. But the thought of continuing to live under the weight of their expectations, to keep playing the part of the ordinary daughter who never quite measured up, was suffocating in a way I couldn't tolerate any longer. My 20s had been a blur of self-doubt and late-night anxiety attacks, shuffling between low-paying jobs while trying to pay off my own student loans and just barely keeping my head above water, all while my father's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that I was too ordinary, too mediocre, too unremarkable to ever deserve celebration or pride. Every birthday was a reminder that, I was invisible to the people whose opinions mattered most, and with every passing year, I became more determined to find a way to mark my existence that didn't rely on their approval or acknowledgement. So when the call finally came that afternoon, it was no surprise that it was my mother on the other end of the line, her voice trembling with a mix of gratitude and confusion as she thanked me over and over again, almost afraid to believe the reality of what I had done. And when my father's voice finally joined hers, low and curt as always, I heard the hesitation beneath the bravado, the silent question of what my gesture meant and whether it was an olive branch or a final goodbye. I chose my words carefully, knowing that any explanation might be twisted into weakness or defiance. So I kept it simple, almost dismissive, telling them it was just a gift to myself, a way to acknowledge everything I had survived, everything I had endured in silence while they looked the other way. And in that moment, I could hear the quiet unraveling of their certainty, the unspoken understanding that I was no longer the girl who needed their approval, but a woman who had finally claimed her own worth in a way they could neither control nor contest. But beneath the surface, the silence stretched out like a chasm, filled with unasked questions and unresolved tensions that neither of us was brave enough to cross yet. And as the day faded into evening, I found myself caught between a strange cocktail of relief and loneliness, knowing that this was only the beginning of a new kind of distance, one forged not from neglect or disappointment, but from the deliberate, undeniable act of breaking free. I thought about how my brother Jake would react. Always the peacemaker, the one who tried to bridge the gaps and smooth over the rough edges, but even he hadn't reached out yet, probably unsure whether to celebrate my gesture or question my silence. In that moment, I realized that paying off their mortgage wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a statement, a quiet but unmistakable declaration that I was no longer invisible, no longer willing to be overlooked or minimized, and that the ordinariness they once assigned to me was nothing but a lie I had long since outgrown. I wondered how long it would take before they could see me not as their ordinary daughter, but as someone who had, in her own way, finally stepped out of the shadows to claim her place, on her own terms. As the night grew darker and the house around me settled into uneasy quiet, I sat with the knowledge that my birthday had passed without the usual noise, without the clinking of glasses or the forced smiles, replaced instead by a silence filled with questions that might never be answered and a reckoning that had only just begun. And deep down, I knew that this was not just a gift to my parents, but a gift to myself, a reclaiming of my story and my worth, told not in words or parties, but in a gesture that finally made them, and me, pay attention. After the reality of the mortgage being paid off finally sank in, the house that had once been a familiar sanctuary for my family felt colder and more foreign than ever, as though the walls themselves resented the quiet upheaval I had orchestrated in what they still thought was my absence, and it quickly became clear that this unexpected gift wasn't going to be met with the gratitude or relief I had anticipated, but with a tense, unsettling silence that stretched between us like an invisible barrier refusing to be breached. That silence was heavier than any argument we had ever endured, because it wasn't filled with the heat of anger or the sharp edges of blame, but with a subdued, almost grudging acknowledgement of the power shift that had taken place overnight. A shift that no one in my family was prepared to address, least of all my father, who retreated into himself with a coldness that only deepened the divide I had hoped to heal, or at the very least, redefine. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog of unspoken words and half-hearted gestures, where every attempt at normal conversation was weighed down by the invisible question hanging in the air. What had I really done? And why had I chosen this silent battleground instead of the noisy confrontations of the past? My mother, caught in the delicate balance of wanting to express gratitude but fearing the repercussions of acknowledging my gesture too openly, offered small smiles that never quite reached her eyes, and hesitant thanks that felt more like rehearsed lines than heartfelt emotion, while my brother Jake, always the one who tried to smooth over the rough edges and keep the family afloat, skirted around the subject entirely, as if pretending nothing had changed might somehow make the tension disappear. I found myself retreating more and more into the quiet corners of my life, outside their walls, seeking refuge in conversations with Lisa, my best friend, who listened without judgment as I tried to untangle the complicated knot of emotions that had been unleashed by my decision. Over greasy diner coffee and the background hum of clinking plates and muffled conversations, I confessed to her that the silence from my family hurt more than the years of neglect, because it meant that my gesture had not been understood as an act of love or defiance, but as a challenge to be met with avoidance and cold distance. Lisa, with her usual blunt honesty, suggested that maybe this was exactly what I wanted all along, that my silence and my gift were less about healing and more about forcing them to see me in a way that couldn't be ignored, even if it meant burning some bridges along the way. One afternoon, as I was fixing the garden hose in the garage, a place where I had spent countless hours as a kid watching my father tinker with his tools and machines, I felt his presence behind me before he spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel. "Don't think for a second that this changes me," he said, not looking at me, as if admitting any softness would undermine the decades of distance he had built between us. I turned slowly, touching the old lawnmower he had taught me to use when I was barely old enough to reach the handles, and in that moment, I found a strength in reminding him of the memories that still lived beneath the bitterness and pride. "You used to teach me how to ride my bike and never once told me I was ordinary then," I said quietly, meeting his gaze, challenging the walls he had built around himself. He didn't respond, just turned and walked away, leaving me with a strange mixture of victory and loneliness, because while I had stood my ground and claimed my own worth, the gulf between us felt wider than ever. That night, when the house had settled into an uneasy quiet, my mother came to find me in the kitchen, her eyes glistening with tears she tried desperately to hide, and she pulled me into a hug that spoke of years of worry and regret. But beneath the warmth, I sensed the weight of unspoken fears and fractured hopes, the kind of embrace that wants to heal but knows it can't undo what's already been done. Later, when I was alone, I found a letter tucked into the pocket of my father's old coat, a letter half burnt, its edges curled and stained with smoke, as if it had narrowly escaped destruction. Dated back to my 15th birthday. As I unfolded the fragile paper under the dim light, I discovered words written in my father's hand that revealed a hidden tenderness I had never been allowed to see, words telling me he was proud of me, that he believed in me, but that he had thrown the letter away because he was afraid I would think it was a mistake, or that I wouldn't want it. Reading that letter broke something inside me, a mixture of sadness and understanding that complicated all the anger I had carried for so long. The next family dinner was as awkward as I had feared, with my mother nervously trying to keep the conversation light and my father retreating into silence. But as the meal wore on, I slid the letter across the table without a word, watching as his eyes flicked to the worn paper and back to me, his face unreadable. "I found this," I said simply, the quiet weight of those words hanging between us like a challenge and an invitation all at once. And when I added, "I paid off the mortgage, Dad, so you wouldn't have to burn letters like this again," the tension in the room thickened, his silence answering louder than any argument could. Tears glistened in my mother's eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something I hadn't expected. Regret, maybe, or the faintest hope of reconciliation. But my father turned away abruptly, his voice cold and edged with pain when he said, "You don't get to feel like you've won," leaving me with a sense of victory tinged with sorrow, knowing that while I had claimed my own space, the battle was far from over, and the true reckoning lay somewhere in the uncertain future that awaited us all. The letter was a ghost from the past, fragile and worn, folded carefully but forgotten for years. In the pocket of my father's coat, its edges scorched as though it had narrowly escaped destruction, and as I held it in my hands late that night, under the soft glow of the kitchen light, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread settling in my chest, knowing that within those few pages lay a truth about my father I had never dared to imagine, that beneath his gruff exterior and cold dismissals, there was once a man capable of quiet tenderness, of pride in a daughter he rarely showed. But the fact that he had hidden this letter, this expression of love and encouragement, and then nearly destroyed it, spoke volumes about the complicated relationship we had shared, one defined by silence and misunderstanding rather than open affection. Reading the words he had written when I was 15, a time when I was desperately seeking approval and validation from the very person who seemed determined to withhold it, revealed a side of him that was vulnerable and human, a father who wanted to believe in me, but was shackled by his own fears and the unyielding expectations of what it meant to be a man in his world. And in that moment, the anger and resentment I had carried for so long began to twist into something more complex, a tangled web of empathy, sorrow, and the painful realization that we had both been prisoners of a story neither of us fully understood. I remembered vividly that 15th birthday, how I had practiced a speech for the school assembly, standing in front of a crowd I barely knew, hoping to prove that I was more than just ordinary, that I had a voice worth hearing, and how my father's approval, even if it was just a simple note, had meant the world to me, only to be crushed later when the letter was hidden away. A secret kept from my eyes. A testament to the emotional barriers that defined our relationship. The letter revealed his pride and his belief in my potential, yet it also exposed his struggle to express those feelings in a way that didn't betray his stoic image, and I couldn't help but wonder how many moments, how many words had been lost between us simply because we were both too afraid to break the pattern of silence that had grown over the years like an unshakable fog. That night, as I reread the letter multiple times, tracing the familiar handwriting and feeling the weight of every sentence, I realized that my decision to pay off their mortgage was not just an act of financial liberation, but also a deeply personal reckoning, a way to force a conversation that had been avoided for far too long, a way to hold up a mirror to the past and demand that we confront the truths we had buried beneath layers of pride, pain, and misunderstanding. I knew that bringing this letter to light at the family dinner would be a risk, that it could open wounds or bridge gaps, but either way, it was a necessary step toward breaking the cycle that had defined us. When the evening arrived, the air in the room was thick with unspoken tension, the clinking of utensils on plates echoing the awkwardness that hung between us like a heavy curtain. And as my mother tried to keep the conversation flowing with her usual gentle humor, my father remained guarded and distant, his eyes betraying little of the emotions roiling beneath the surface. It was then that I reached into my bag and slid the letter across the table, watching as his gaze fell on the worn paper, a flicker of recognition passing through his expression before he looked back at me, his face unreadable, but his posture stiffening with a mixture of surprise and defensiveness. "I found this," I said softly, my voice steady despite the storm inside me, "and I thought you should see it." The room seemed to hold its breath as the weight of my words settled over us, and when I added, "I paid off the mortgage, Dad, so you wouldn't have to burn letters like this again," the tension tightened, a silent challenge that dared him to respond, to acknowledge the years of pain and silence that had preceded this moment. For a heartbeat, I saw something shift in his eyes, a glimpse of vulnerability, regret, or perhaps even sorrow. But then he turned away abruptly, his voice low and edged with the bitterness that had defined much of our relationship when he said, "You don't get to feel like you've won," leaving me with a complex mixture of triumph and heartbreak, knowing that while I had taken a significant step toward reclaiming my worth and telling my story, the path to true understanding and reconciliation was far from over. In the quiet that followed, my mother reached out and took my hand, her touch warm but trembling with emotion, and in that moment, I realized that the letter had done more than just reopen old wounds. It had peeled back the layers of silence that had kept us apart, forcing us to confront the imperfect, painful truth of our family, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could begin to heal. As I lay awake that night, the letter resting on my bedside table like a beacon of both the past and the future, I found myself caught between the relief of having uncovered a hidden truth and the uncertainty of what it meant for the road ahead, knowing that some battles were won, not with fireworks or grand gestures, but with the quiet courage to face the darkness and the willingness to hold on to hope, even when the outcome remained unknown. The morning after the dinner, the air between us still heavy with unspoken emotions and fragile hope, my phone rang just as the sunlight crept through the blinds, painting golden lines across the kitchen counter, where I stood stirring my coffee. And when I saw my father's name light up on the screen, a mix of hesitation and curiosity curled in my chest, because after years of distance and silence, this simple call carried the weight of everything we hadn't said, everything we had avoided. And as I answered, his voice was quieter than I expected, rough around the edges but surprisingly soft. "Thanks," he said, almost awkwardly, as if those two words were difficult to say, but they held more meaning than any grand apology ever could. And in that moment, I realized that the power dynamic between us was shifting in subtle, almost imperceptible ways that neither of us was quite ready to fully understand or embrace. I hesitated before replying, searching for the right words that wouldn't undo what little progress we had made, but would also honor the complexity of the emotions swirling beneath the surface. And so I told him plainly, it was just a gift to myself for everything I survived. A sentence that carried years of pain, resilience, and quiet strength wrapped in a simple truth, reminding both of us that this gesture wasn't about obligation or praise, but about reclaiming my own story and worth in a world that had tried to define me by everything I wasn't. The silence that followed felt like a shared breath, a pause in the ongoing conversation between two people who had spent decades on different sides of the same wall. And then I found the courage to ask, "Can I come home for dinner?" My voice tentative but hopeful, breaking through the distance with an invitation that felt both fragile and necessary. After what felt like an eternity, his answer came, low and hesitant, but unmistakably clear. "Show up." Those two words opened a door I hadn't dared to knock on for years, a chance to begin the slow, messy process of rebuilding something neither of us knew how to fix, but both of us wanted more than we were willing to admit. That evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing the lasagna I remembered Mom loved, chopping garlic and herbs with the familiar rhythm of years gone by, I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. A mix of anxiety, hope, and the quiet knowledge that this dinner would be a test not just of our relationship, but of the fragile truce we were attempting to forge. The house was filled with the sounds of clattering dishes and tentative conversation, the awkward laughter that comes when people try to fill spaces left empty by years of silence. And as we gathered around the table, the tension was palpable, but beneath it, there was also a flicker of something new, maybe forgiveness, maybe understanding, or simply the recognition that we were all imperfect people trying to find our way through the mess of family and history. I caught my father's eye across the table and saw in it a glimpse of the pride he had once hidden so well, a flicker of the man who had quietly written that letter when I was 15, and I thought about the journey that had brought us here, the silences, the wounds, the small acts of rebellion and love that had finally broken through the walls. As the evening wore on and the lasagna was passed around, slightly burnt at the edges but made with care, we laughed, badly, unevenly, but genuinely, and in those moments, I felt the fragile threads of connection knitting us together in a way that no amount of anger or disappointment could fully undo. The conversation meandered between memories and awkward silences, confessions and deflections, but underneath it all was the unspoken acknowledgement that this was only the beginning, that the scars of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, but that we were willing, finally, to face them together. Later, as I stood by the doorway watching my family move around the house, the sounds of their voices blending with the quiet hum of the night, I thought about how I had come full circle, not because I had forgiven or forgotten, but because I had finally claimed my own space in their world, not as the ordinary daughter they once dismissed, but as a woman who had survived, who had fought in silence, and who had, at last, decided to celebrate herself in a way they could neither deny nor diminish. The gift I had given them, and more importantly to myself, was not just the freedom from debt, but the freedom from expectation, the right to be seen on my own terms. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes the most powerful celebrations are the quiet ones, born from pain and resilience, wrapped in silence, and filled with the possibility of something new. So, as the night deepened and the house settled into a peaceful lull, I allowed myself to breathe, to hope, and to imagine a future where laughter, imperfect and unpolished, could fill the spaces that silence once ruled, knowing that while the journey ahead was uncertain, this small victory was enough, for now.